I'm Jay Solomon.
And I'm Hagar Chemali.
And welcome to the Threat Podcast. Every week, we'll analyze and discuss the most pressing, yet not always so visible, threats to global security and the movements and ideologies that fuel extremism and terrorism.
We'll take listeners to the front lines of these battles, both at home and abroad, and we'll talk with the key players in law enforcement, intelligence, diplomacy, and academia who are working to counter these threats.
Welcome to the Threat Podcast. I'm Jay Solomon.
And I'm Hagar Chemali.
Today we're going to discuss a whole new kind of terrorism called anti-technology extremism, which is essentially where opposition to technological advances, like in AI and data centers, leads to forms of political violence and terrorism. U.S. and European law enforcement agencies are increasingly concerned about this kind of extremism as a potential driver of political violence and terrorism globally. In early April, a 20-year-old Texas man threw a Molotov cocktail at the San Francisco home of OpenAI CEO Sam Altman before threatening to attack the company's headquarters. The same week, 13 gunshots were fired at the home of an Indiana lawmaker after he supported the construction of a $500 million data center in his district. A note reading "No data center" was left at the scene. Extremist organizations, meanwhile, with names like the Volcano Group and ITF, have formed in Europe and Latin America to try and stop the rapid advancement of AI and other disruptive technologies in their communities. Hagar, this is a bit of a shift from the type of extremism we've been talking about. It's got a Terminator feel to it. What do you think? This is an interesting change for us.
Yeah, this is so not something I would have ever expected or seen, for our future, for the way things would go, that this could be so real. And it feels like we're at the beginning of it. Like the thing I kept thinking about when we were preparing for the podcast today was, do you remember at commencement this year at a number of universities across the country, you had students booing very loudly anytime anybody, a commencement speaker or an administrator or a dean at a school would say, and you should all be careful because AI could take your jobs, or, they would say something to this effect, or you should prepare yourselves to know AI or understand it because it's going to affect your careers. And there'd be loud boos. And it really, you and I obviously we weren't in that generation, so we don't understand. But I do fear that kind of lays the foundation for this, right? There's this real genuine hatred and fear of this technology, and it is laying the foundation for extremism in a form of extremism I never thought I would see.
Yeah. And it is a big shift. I remember when I was graduating Berkeley at the time, everyone was going into tech and it was so optimistic. We're all going to get rich and everyone's going to be happy. So yeah, it's a big shift, and it was scary. Well, to dive into this more today, we have an incredible guest with us. Mauro Lubrano is a lecturer on international relations at the University of Bath, even though he's an Italy native, in the UK, and earned his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. His research focuses primarily on terrorism and political violence and how it innovates and evolves. And he's one of a very small number of academics who have begun focusing on the advent of this anti-tech extremism. Mauro is also the author of the book Stop the Machines, The Rise of Anti-Technology Extremism, which examines how opposition to the unregulated growth of technology has the potential to become a major driver of political violence from both the left and the right. So Mauro, welcome.
Thanks for the invite. It's great to be here.
I mean, can we just start? I think most of our listeners, as even Hagar and I, probably didn't really think or haven't heard of the term anti-tech terrorism. Can you describe how this phenomenon came to be and how wide scale it is?
Yes, thank you. So although it's now sort of coming to the fore and it's a more prominent phenomenon, this is something that's been going on for a while, for many decades, in fact. I mean, I'm assuming most people will remember the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, and that sort of, if you want, a past example of what's going on now, or in a different way. But again, opposition to technology is not something that starts with AI. This is a phenomenon that predates AI, predates everything that is going on now. We can find roots of this phenomenon, if we go back a few centuries. But if we want to focus on the contemporary era, we can see how opposition to technology has developed since the Industrial Revolution as a phenomenon that is mostly about three types of concerns: a material concern, an ontological concern, and an existential concern. What do these three terms mean? First one means that opposition to technology is motivated by concerns regarding job losses, economic displacements, and so on. We can think of, for example, the Luddites, the 19th century Luddites, a group of skilled artisans who protested the introduction of new machinery in the production process in England. And then there's ontological concerns. And what do I mean by it? I mean the concerns regarding human identity, human agency, decision-making, even concerns about what technology does to humanity on a spiritual level. And finally, we have existential concerns, which are sort of self-explanatory, right? There's this idea that technology will inevitably lead to the extinction of humanity, that technology poses an existential threat to the survival of humanity and also survival of the planet. Now, what's important to understand when we talk about anti-technology extremism is that we're not talking about opposition to a specific technology. We're talking about opposition to technology as a system where it's basically impossible to distinguish between good and bad technology. So the same technologies that allow us to live longer, live healthier, and so on, are also the same technologies that are responsible for the extraction of resources, the management of nature, the division of labor, the oppression of subaltern classes, and so on. So it's impossible to distinguish between these two, between good and bad technology, because technology, again, is a system where all parts are dependent on one another. This is quite important because it means that this system cannot be reformed, it must be destroyed. And here we see how this sort of ideas are already linked to a more like revolutionary approach, if you want. Now, how widespread is it? Now, this is a good question. We can see manifestations of anti-technology violence or anti-technology extremism in Europe, in North America, in South America, and Central America. In terms of hard numbers, we simply don't have any, for a specific reason. Despite being an old phenomenon, despite having been around for many decades, anti-technology extremism has often operated on a very low level. Low-level sabotage, low-level attacks on specific individuals. You've mentioned the attack on Sam Altman. We have precedents of these attacks. We have past examples of these attacks that, however, targeted less prominent individuals. So most of us didn't hear about them. Because of this, and because of the fact that anti-technology extremism tends to emerge within different ideological milieus and combine with different ideological milieus. In many cases, this has been examples of anti-technology violence have been simply miscategorized. I'll give you an example. In 2012, in Italy, where I grew up, there was an attack against the CEO of a nuclear engineering group. This attack was perpetrated by two insurrection anarchists who kneecapped the CEO, and then later, when they were during the trial, they explicitly stated that they did this because of his role, because of the CEO's role in spreading nuclear technology around the world. Now, this attack is, if you look at many databases on terrorism and political violence, is constantly referred to as insurrection anarchist, which is true. It is an insurrection anarchist attack, but it also has a specific anti-technology component that many other insurrection anarchist attacks don't have. So this is one of the reasons why we don't really have a clear idea of the distribution of these attacks, because it's a sort of again, combining with different ideologies, it presents itself as part of different campaigns. But it is important to understand and isolate the anti-technology component of this.
I'm trying to understand a little bit, based on everything you just said, given your research and background, we're trying to understand how large of a threat is this? How prevalent is it? What is the scale of it, right? Like, so we've mentioned now the grenade attack in San Francisco on Sam Altman's home, the shooting residents of the Indian lawmakers Jay mentioned, who supports data centers. Now, you've highlighted some actually older examples that we might not have actually realized classify in this world. So now it kind of feels like we're at the tip of the iceberg. How big of a problem is this? And, how much of a threat? How are there other examples that you can think of in general, just to kind of highlight to us how significant it is? And have we kind of been asleep at the wheel, like, because it hasn't had a name until now?
Yes. So even just looking at the last year, there's dozens of examples of violence against technology, against infrastructure, and against those who represent. Yes.
That's a lot.
For example, like some of them are quite prominent, some of them like relatively small scale. I give an example of a small scale one. In April, there was an attack against the technological hub of a university in Pisa, Italy. But even looking at elsewhere in Europe, there was a prominent attack in January carried out by the Volcano Group against the electric grid in Berlin. That attack left thousands without electricity for hours, if not days, and obviously costed a lot of money to a lot of companies. The Volcano Group is a Germany-based, relatively obscure group. We don't really know much about them. No members have ever been apprehended, so we don't really know much about them. But they've been responsible for many similar operations, both against infrastructure, but also against specific companies. In 2024, they conducted a sabotage attack against the Tesla gigafactory in Grünheide, Berlin, halting production for days and costing millions to the company. There are also similar attacks have been conducted last year against different targets linked to Tesla across Europe. Anarchists in Europe launched this campaign called Welcome Spring, Burn a Tesla. And you had several dealership and production facilities across Europe targeted in a series of relatively uncoordinated but converging clandestine attacks. There's also been attacks on data centers. And here it's good to distinguish between the surface level protests against data centers and the more clandestine campaigns carried out by extremist networks against infrastructure. So attacks carried out in France against data centers. Often these data centers are targeted in particular when they're linked to issues of militarism. For example, the one targeted in France was in November 2025, was linked to, allegedly, according to the attackers, communique was linked to the war in the Middle East, was linked to Israel and so on. There's also been more symbolic attacks, sabotage during, for example, the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in Milan and during the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics in Paris 2 years ago, and during the Cannes Film Festival. So attacks that were conducted during those events, not really to cause disruption, simply to cause disruption, but to send a message and to send a powerful symbolic message to the system, to like-minded individuals and so on. So following kind of the good old-fashioned ideas of propaganda of the deed.
Can you give us a sense of the organizational structure of this? You mentioned this Volcano Group in Europe. There's something I've read about in Latin America called ITS. I haven't read or heard that any of these recent attacks in the US are linked to a particular organization or structure, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. And certainly in the US, which has, we've already have a high surge in kind of political violence, gun violence, it looks like we'd be particularly vulnerable. But yeah, could you talk a bit more about the organizational structure behind this anti-tech movement, and like, who are these people, and could it spread into the US, or maybe it's already here?
Yes, I think to do this, we need to take a step back and look at, again, anti-technology extremism as a whole. So I've mentioned before how anti-technology extremism is essentially against technology as a system. And the ultimate goal, the ultimate objective that underlies anti-technology extremism is the eradication of this system, is the eradication of technology as a whole. So it's an ideological current that pursues the eradication of technology and the collapse of the system that technology sustains. This is quite a flexible framework that can be adapted to different agendas, different ideological backgrounds, right? And in fact, we do see anti-technology ideas emerging across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, to environmental, to eco-extremist movements, and so on. And you could easily imagine how this could even be our anti-technology ideas could even form within a more religious framework. I think some people must have read the letter the Pope wrote a few weeks ago on AI. So there definitely is like fertile ground there. I'm not trying to imply that letter or the Pope are linked to anti-technology extremism. This is just to say that they're quite widespread ideas and that they combine with different belief system. But despite all of these differences, if we look at the extremist or anti-technology extremism, we can identify 4 common characteristics. The first one is this idea of technology as a system, as a mega machine, as many anti-technology extremists put it. And this mega machine has 3 manifestations. The physical, which is the technologies we interact with every day, computer, laptops, wires, cables, and so on. The ideological, the idea that progress must be pursued indefinitely because it can only do good things for society. And finally, the human component. So humans are reduced to cogs in the machine and therefore can be targeted with violence if you want to stop this mega machine. The second component of the second common characteristics that emerge across all of these anti-technology groups is that anti-technology extremism is seen as something that can preserve and defend both humanity and the planet. So there's an idea there that the stakes could not be higher. This is an existential threat to both us and the planet, and therefore anti-technology extremism emerges to defend humans and the planet. There's also a sense of urgency in all of this, which is the third common characteristic. So a sense of an apocalyptic mindset underlying all of this. So the sense of urgency that things are about to happen, which will change the world in ways that we cannot even imagine, and therefore we need to upgrade our commitment to stopping the machine. Finally, and here is where we link all of this to your question, there's an idea that to fight the machine, you have to adopt a leaderless and accelerationist fight. What does this mean? Let's start from the latter term, accelerationism, which is quite a widespread strategy among many terrorist organizations these days. In the context of anti-technology extremism, it means you have to hit where it hurts. Basically, instead of striking random technologies that have little to no strategic meaning for the system, you have to strike the system where you are more likely to produce harm, like catastrophic and cascade effect. So, which is why we see attacks on infrastructures, why we see attacks on the electric grids, why we see attacks on data centers, and so on. So essentially, it's about understanding what are the pillars of the system and striking the pillars to make the system collapse. And so there's an attempt to hasten this collapse. And this is done in a leaderless way. Now, leaderlessness is, again, quite widespread as a feature among many contemporary extremist and terrorist organizations. It essentially means adopting decentralized structures that do not rely on any hierarchy or network of support to minimize the chances of being infiltrated and therefore dismantled, which in a way increases the group's resilience. Now, within many anti-technology groups, the adoption of a leaderless structure is not only because of the increased resilience that this structure affords, but is also because it reflects certain ideological assumptions. To be anti-technology is to be anti-civilization within the extremist sphere. to be anti-technology means that you are against the entire system. So to be against the system, it means that you're also against the civilization that it's based on it. This means that many groups, especially in the anarchist and eco-extremist sphere, will tend to avoid any form of hierarchical structure, also because these hierarchical structures reproduce the logics of the system themselves. So if you want to get rid of the system, you also have to get rid of those practices that could reproduce the system even on a small scale level. This is why many of these groups, again, don't adopt hierarchical structures, but also why many of these groups don't really have plans for the future. They simply are focused on destroying the system in the present. Now, when it comes to could this reach the US, now one of the many ideological milieus that displays anti-technology ideas is so-called eco-fascism, which is something that is quite widespread in the US. The attack in San Diego from a few weeks ago, if you look at the manifesto, there are references to AI as well there. Now,
this is the attack on the mosque in San Diego.
Yes, exactly. So obviously we do see a mismatch between the anti-technology narrative and the practice of these groups, because obviously they didn't attack technology. But it's interesting to see that there's that component there as well of anti-technology. This is something we've seen in past eco-fascist attacks as well, where in the manifesto you did see references to automation, AI, and all sorts of different things related to technologies, even though they were still targeting religious and ethnic minorities. So there's a bit of a mismatch between practice and theory there. But this is why these groups, again, don't have hierarchical structures, don't have official leaders. They have more like, informal leaders or influencers, if you want. They operate ironically online and speak to each other online through communiques, manifestos, and so on. But they probably don't even know each other. Like if you put two of them in the same room, they probably wouldn't even know each other.
When you talked about this volcano group in Europe, do they claim responsibility in some amorphous way, or do they not even they'll do an attack and I don't know, people find out it's the volcano group?
This is actually a very important question because and it leads back to some practices within insurrection anarchist groups. Now, some insurrection anarchist groups do use acronyms or do use groups names and will claim attacks. So obviously it's based on the principle of direct action. So whoever is sympathetic or with these ideas or affiliated with the movement will carry out an action on their own, and independently with the means that they have at their disposal and when and where they want, and then will upload a communique explaining why they carried out the attack, the rationale, and calling for more attacks on these targets. So the Volcano Group is one of those groups that claims attacks, that puts out communiques and signs them. There are other anarchist networks that do not believe in using acronyms or names because they think that essentially leads to a politics of representation, which they don't want because they prefer a more direct, involvement. So it leads back to some theoretical debates within anarchism. But the short answer is many of them do claim, some not, because again, there is a difference in opinion on whether attacks should be claimed or not.
It's just fascinating to me because, well, first, Mauro, you're blowing my mind in many ways, but also because, and I don't mean to compare this at all, but because the Bitcoin community is they also share these beliefs, this worldview belief of, no leader, a lot of it is anonymous. They operate online. Obviously, they're not pursuing terrorist attacks, but so I don't mean to make that kind of comparison. But they are also trying to revolutionize and disrupt entire systems. Can you unpack a little bit further the role of the Unabomber and in this, right? How can you explain why he remains an important figure in this movement?
Yes, I always make this. You can call it a joke if you want, but I'm not even sure if it's a joke. I think it's actually quite true. Now, I always say this: to be anti-technology, an anti-technology extremist today, without engaging in some way with Kaczynski, with the Unabomber, is like being in the 70s in a Marxist-Leninist organization without engaging at all with Marx. Like, you just have to, in a way or another, engage with this figure, engage with the intellectual heritage of this figure. The Unabomber, of course, started his one-man war against technology in 1978, and until he was apprehended in the mid-90s. And before being arrested, he produced this manifesto, the famous Manifesto of the Unabomber, Industrial Society and its Future. Now, back then, of course, like, people did engage with it, but it's quite remarkable how essentially 25 years later, this manifesto became very influential again, and a lot of people started reading it. And again, we do see how groups with completely different ideological background started quoting and engaging and critiquing and getting inspiration from Kaczynski. Now, we see anarchists talking about Kaczynski. We see the far right considering Kaczynski as one of the most influential saints within this saints culture that characterizes far right extremism. We do see eco-extremists, like you mentioned earlier, the individually standing towards the wild, ITS, this Mexican group. We do see this group engaging with both theory and practice from Kaczynski. Essentially, what Kaczynski did, Kaczynski, you can consider it like, if you want, the father of contemporary anti-technology extremism. He is the one who has developed a vocabulary that a lot of contemporary anti-technology extremism use or have to deal with, even in explaining why they're not using it. His ideas resonate a lot with both violent extremists and individuals that do not engage in violence. And one of the main contributions is this idea of, again, of technology as a system, as technology is something where it's not good or bad. It's a system. It cannot be reformed. It must be destroyed. His lessons also provide justifications when it comes to resorting to technology to destroy technology. Kaczynski made these theoretical differences between small-scale and organization-dependent technology, which essentially provided, again, an ideological justification for retaining a certain level of technology and also for using technology in the fight against technology. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that all of his lessons are considered valuable. And again, there's many aspects on which all groups disagree with him. I'll give you an example. Kaczynski argued that it's crucial for an anti-technology revolution to have what he calls, professional, like, anti-tech warriors. Essentially, although he doesn't use the term, he was referring to a revolutionary vanguard, like the classic Leninist revolutionary vanguard, the group of professional revolutionaries dedicated entirely and only on the fight against technology. And for example, anarchists completely reject this idea because they reject the idea that the vanguardism is a bad thing for anarchists. There's also other aspects on which, for example, eco-fascists and Kaczynski will disagree. What I always find a remarkable thing is that all of these groups engage with him and admit to having learned something from him, and will disagree in other cases. But then before dying, he died 3 years ago, Kaczynski, before he passed away, he wrote about all of these groups and essentially critiqued all of them. In many cases, he said that they completely misread his work. They didn't really understand what he was talking about. He talked about ITS, saying that they had a kindergarten level of understanding of revolution. He criticized eco-fascism for placing so much emphasis on white supremacy and so on, which wasn't really an important thing for Kaczynski. And also completely disagreed with insurrectionary anarchists about pretty much everything they said or did. So it was pretty much a one-way relationship where all these groups are like looking up to Kaczynski and trying to draw inspiration or learn from maybe his mistakes or his successes and disagreeing and agreeing. But yeah, the Unabomber wasn't really reciprocating that.
Mauro, can you talk what seems kind of dangerous, particularly about this anti-tech movement, is that it attracts people from across the political spectrum, people you wouldn't think would have any commonality whatsoever. Can you speak a bit more to these kind of strange bedfellows who are attracted from? You talked about it a bit. Some from the theological, some from the humanistic, some from just the kind of economic side of it. But can you talk about this? How this draws people from across the political spectrum?
Yes, I argue that one of the most, if not the most remarkable characteristics of anti-technology extremism as an ideological current is that it's inherently incredibly flexible. You can compare it to some extent as the opposition to capitalism. We have seen many different expressions of oppositions to capitalism, right? From left to right to religious and so on. So it's engendered like a multifaceted response. And the same with technology, really. We see how anti-technology extremism can be combined with class struggle. And here are the ideas that technology essentially allows what the so-called techno elites to build a new authoritarian society thanks to technology. What's being called by some anti-technology extremists the totalitarianism of the machines. So it can be combined with the class struggle, but it can also be combined with extremist interpretations of deep ecology. So the idea that humans are not the most important living creature on Earth, and actually all living creatures have same equal worth. And this is the idea that underlies ITS, and ITS actually consider themselves as part of nature. And they view wild nature and technology trapped in this cosmic conflict where one cannot thrive without harming the other. So it can combine with this sort of more environmentalist perspectives, the defense of nature, the defense of animals, and so on. It, of course, has not, what I'm not referring to contemporary radical environmentalist movements and mass movements. I'm referring to this, more extremist versions like ITS. But it also combines with white supremacy in the case of, again, the eco-fascists. If you think that within eco-fascism and within the work of some of its most influential figures, like Pentti Linkola, a Finnish eco-fascist, technology is viewed as this force of modernity that has destroyed the ties between nature and nation. So whereby the idea is that nature, the environment, is the most important element that characterizes the nation. And so if we destroy the environment, that also has repercussions on this idea of the nation. So it's quite flexible in many ways, and it allows for like dangerous synergies to emerge and allows for this framework to be adapted to different contexts and different campaigns and different agendas and different ideological backgrounds, which is why we've seen, like, again, in Europe, it's more linked to insurrectionary anarchist ideas. In South Central America, it's more linked to this eco-extremist phenomenon. And in other parts, like North America, but North Europe as well, it's more linked to eco-fascist ideas. So this allows it to emerge within all of these different contexts. Now, at the same time, we do live in an era where many terrorist organizations, terrorist individuals do show like multifaceted worldviews. And this allows, again, anti-technology ideas to have potential to combine with many different ideas. Now, will there be the emergence of a more monolithic anti-technology or anti-AI movement? It's possible. But even if we look at what's going on now with all of this anti-AI backlash, we do see that it's always linked to certain broader issues, the environment, issues of, again, material concerns that can lead back to some ideas of class in a way. If you think of all this concerns about big tech and all of this, so it cannot. I would argue that it cannot really emerge in a vacuum. but because of this flexibility, it can emerge in very different contexts and in very different and combined with many different ideological backgrounds.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit toward how we solve this issue and the potential for regulation. You've written about this before. If the primary grievance of anti-tech terrorists is an unaccountable, globalized, quote unquote, technological mega machine, how can sovereign states regulate cross-border tech entities like AI conglomerates, for example? How can they regulate them effectively enough to maintain institutional legitimacy while preventing radicalization?
Yes, I think this is like a very important question and something that we need to get done, that we need to get right. I would argue that the response to anti-technology extremism requires a more of a whole of society kind of response, but obviously governments and states have a crucial role to play. And I think the first thing is to clearly identify who the threat is and clearly distinguish between these anti-technology extremists who resort to violence and operate in a clandestine way, from people who are demanding more accountability, more transparency, and more regulation when it comes to unchecked technological progress. Now, the thing is that, as I was saying at the beginning, there are still like many things we don't know about this phenomenon. We need to go back and get a better like empirical understanding of it, the geographical distributions of the attack, the operational patterns, and so on. But we also need to get a clear idea of who is populating this anti-tech space, because many of the people populating this space do not embrace extremist goals, do not embrace extremist ideals, and do not use violence. So if we are to build an anti-tech extremist threat category, which, as in recent news there's been in discussion within US law enforcement, we are only to include those most violent factions in it. Because if we use this category to securitize individuals, networks, associations, groups, and so on that are demanding more accountability, transparency, and regulation, then essentially we are validating some of the narratives of anti-technology extremism. One of the main themes that constantly emerges within anti-tech extremist narratives is this idea of technology as pervasive surveillance, and technology as a means of repression, as a tool of repression. So we don't need to validate these narratives, and we need to steer clear from these practices. So isolate the extremist violent factions and engage with the ones employing democratic means and demanding more accountability, transparency, and regulation. Now, this is very important because if we deny this political opportunity to these groups, this political opportunity to shape progress, then what we run the risk of pushing some individuals, not all of them, of course, towards this ideological container that already exists there, which is anti-technology extremism. And I would also argue that those who are more negatively affected by progress deserve a saying in how progress is shaped in the first place. Now, obviously, in terms of isolating and engaging with these groups, there's a lot that governments can do, but there's also a lot that governments cannot do because, again, as you mentioned, this is like global phenomenon. And this is where we go back to this idea of a whole of society approach. This requires also tech companies, people who are investing in technology, people who are shaping technologies, to be involved in these discussions, and to be involved in these discussions in a way that includes, again, people who have legitimate and real concerns about technology. Because the problem is that the overwhelming majority of people who have concerns about technology have concerns that are real and legitimate. They're not concerns about the mega machine. They're concerns about resources, their environment, their jobs, and so on. So again, neglecting, or worse, securitizing these forms of tech dissent just risks denying these people the political opportunity to shape progress and in turn push them towards this ideological containers. So how do we prevent further radicalization? By addressing the root causes of the concerns that people have about technology. And this is something we can do. It's something that only requires the political will to do it.
I'm curious, are there any countries or leaders or writers or individuals who you think have kind of shown a way to balance all this, that have innovative ideas about how to kind of integrate technology without causing this backlash?
Well, I'm a bit of a pessimistic person by nature. I'm not sure if I can identify many. There's definitely like people like on the, like people have been writing about this, and there's been a few books released recently that sort of discuss these things. In terms of the people that I'm most pessimistic about, I would say, unfortunately, is exactly the people that are at the, forefront of developing technologies. And we go back to this idea of course, profit versus, what's good for society. In terms of governments, it's a tough one because right now, asking to regulate AI in a moment of heightened, great power competition and all of this is seen as a sort of negative thing for many reasons. I think I'm a bit pessimistic again.
It's strange because some of these big AI leaders, whether it's Altman or Elon Musk, they seem at times to talk about the threat from it, but yet they still keep pushing ahead and moving ahead. So yeah, it's hard. It does seem to be some truth to what you're saying, that people recognize the threat, but the competition, whether it's just business or it's strategic and national, seems to kind of override any real kind of thinking about how to bring in outside voices and make it a more kind of inclusive approach. As law enforcement centers begin flagging nonviolent, progressive advocacy of tech infrastructure as potential threat vectors, where should democracies draw the line between civil environmental dissent and the prevention of eco-terrorism? Like, where do you think they draw that line?
Again, this is an important question because, as I mentioned, there's hundreds of non-violent legal movements. Some of these movements don't also have worldviews that are not too different from those of the violent groups. They just don't use violence to achieve their goals. So there are groups. There's one group in France called Anti-Tech Revolution, which is a legal and non-violent movement. But the goal of this group is still the complete eradication of technology. Now, I would argue that, a healthy democracy should be able to, obviously, should be able to like coexist with these views as long as they're non-violent. So I'd say the line is, I would say that many of the forms of critique of technologies that we see today are something that can be very good and positive for society because it's signaling that there's something in the way that technology and progress is marching that is causing harm among many different sectors of society. So we need to listen to these critics and learn from them and address the root causes, as I was saying a minute ago. Then, of course, when we get into the realm of violence and underground activities and the use of terrorism as symbolic, and form of violence against representatives of the system or against infrastructure that could cause disruption among for many people, then I think that's where we draw the line. And I think it's, again, I think this is a crucial moment for this because we have, I guess, an incredible opportunity to address these root causes before they become even bigger. But all of this depends on our approach and how we distinguish again between the anti-tech extremists, the anti-tech terrorists, and people who are demanding more fairness in all of this AI and technological revolution. So it's it's definitely one area where we shouldn't like overreact, and we shouldn't securitize. And it's a bit, it's reminiscent of what was happening in the late 90s and early 2000s, when several radical environmentalist groups were all of a sudden considered the number one domestic terrorist threat in the US. And none of these groups really ever killed anyone. They set a few things on fire, yes, sure. But there's a difference between setting something on fire, liberating a few animals, and putting bombs in public squares or mass shootings and all of that. So to have a heavy-handed response to this might actually, as I was saying a few minutes ago, just be one of the main drivers of radicalization in this regard.
It's fascinating. Mauro, we're so grateful for the time you've spent with us. I feel like your work really exemplifies what we're trying to achieve here, Jay and I, on this podcast, which is to really highlight these threats that are really not so visible and yet important to understand. So thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, where can listeners find you or learn more about your work?
You can find me on LinkedIn, but also on my university webpage, University of Bath. Just type my name, Mauro Lubrano, and you will find all of the links to my work. And then my book can be purchased on various different digital platforms. The publisher is Politis, can be purchased directly from the publisher website, or again, all of the usual digital platforms to buy books. I also have a few other shorter pieces available in several digital outlets, from the GNet to ICCT. Yes.
Amazing. Well, and so for listeners, again, Mauro's book is Stop the Machines, The Rise of Anti-Technology Extremism. Before you go, if you've made it this far, please consider leaving us a review, hopefully a good one. It makes a huge difference for us in helping people find us. And if you have an idea or question for us, or just want to say hi, send us a note at thethreatpod@gwu.email.edu. Bye.
Thanks a lot.